Welcome to the Low Countries Radio, a collaboration between Republic of Amsterdam Radio and the Low Countries website, celebrating Flemish and Dutch history and culture and its impact on the world today.
Hello and welcome to Low Countries Radio. I'm Joe Wegasani and joining me is Julian Smith.
Hello.
In this episode, we are interviewing Elyzabeth Gorman, storyteller-in-chief of Badass Tours, a company in Amsterdam that aims to communicate what they describe as hidden histories, stories of women, people of colour, and members of LGBTQ plus communities whose lives and experiences are so often overlooked or even willfully ignored in the mainstream telling of Dutch history. As you will hear in the interview, Elyzabeth is originally from the United States, but moved to the Netherlands a few years ago at the behest of her partner. When a visa glitch meant that she couldn't work for a few months, she used that time to teach herself Dutch and immerse herself in the many archives and libraries of the Netherlands as a way to alleviate the stress she was feeling at her personal situation. I guess there's something very calming about sitting in a quiet room surrounded by dusty old books. Now, along with her dedicated tour company, Elyzabeth does public speaking events at museums around the country and has made it her mission to communicate lesser-known histories of the Netherlands in English. Sounds like our kind of person. While there's a range of areas that Elyzabeth covers in her work, for this episode we wanted to particularly focus on LGBTQ plus history, since we personally feel like this is an area which we have also neglected in our podcasting so far and which we could learn a lot more about ourselves. We hope you enjoy. Here's Elyzabeth Gorman. Could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how you came to be here?
Sure. So my background is in New York theater, and we came here on vacation, and my partner just fell in love with the city. And at the time, I was doing professional theater in New York, and I said, oh no, I'm not leaving New York. And there was, a little bit of push-pull for like 6 years. And then I was done with theater. And I know it was actually a couple months, but in my head, it's like I was done with theater. And the next day, my partner had a Gantt chart and a budget and a timeline for how we could move to Amsterdam. And we ended up being incredibly lucky because I fell head over heels in love with this city. This is my favorite place that I've ever lived.
So your partner managed to do all the logistical, practical, make it all feasible. And then you came here and the city spoke to you.
I mean, that's a very Dutch way to do it, right? Let someone else do the logistics.
100%. So arriving here from the United States, you have found yourself working more and more in the communication of history. Now, can you tell us a little bit, was this part of your background in theatre in the US, and how did that journey unravel?
Sure. The more I worked in theater, the more I became interested in the stories we tell and how we tell them. So I started working on shows that featured women more heavily. And then I started researching. I actually got a fellowship that allowed me to research at the Folger Library, which is the major manuscript library in the US. And from there, I built this play about women in this medieval civil war in England to kind of talk about how we feel about women in power. I was also working on a play that it was an Asian American response to Top Girls. So it used Asian history to explore the experience of Asian American women. So I'd done that sort of research before I got here. And then when I got here, there was a little hitch with my visa, so I couldn't work for a couple months. And I'm a stress researcher, so I just spent the entire time at the library diving into everything I could find out about this city. And I discovered all these amazing women that I would have been writing about back in the US, but at the time, their stories were only available in Dutch. So I started to make it my mission to tell people these stories and make these stories available.
And what a great mission it is, but it seems there's a logical obstacle to all that. How was your Dutch?
Well, I moved here with a 12-week Rosetta Stone. So my Dutch was very unhandy, as they would say in Dutch. So I would sit there at the public library with like teenagers playing footsie across from me and an angry old person reading the newspaper next to me. And I was surrounded by books, and I had my computer open to reverso.context.net because that was the best translation engine at the time. And I would like slowly drag my finger along the text, looking up every third word. So it's a good way I read Dutch and I listen to Dutch really well now because of that. Although still when I speak Dutch, people respond in English.
Yeah, it's a curse that befalls us all, that one. So sitting in the library, teaching yourself Dutch, and you start delving into the so-called hidden histories. Can you just talk to us a little bit about that term? What does it mean to you?
I mean, honestly, I think hidden history is kind of a gentle term because a lot of this was not hidden so much as intentionally ignored. One example on my women's history tour, people assume that if a woman isn't talked about in history, it's because no one wrote down what she did. There's a woman who was the first Black millionaire in the Americas. She had 2 different Estates Generals Acts, one of which just was about her. The other one legalized interracial marriage. And within a decade of her death, her story was gone. So it's hidden history in the sense of like, it's not what we're teaching children. It's not part of our story that we tell ourselves about ourselves. But I don't know if it's actually hidden. But so the reason we tell these stories, the reason we talk about women in history, people of color in Dutch history, queer people in Dutch history, is for 2 reasons. First of all, it's really important to see yourself reflected in history. It's really damaging to never see anyone that you identify with in the whole course of your schooling, the whole story that your nation tells itself about itself. And there are some really ugly things happening in the world based on a misunderstanding of history. For example, like an easy example is, people who are not accepting of trans people will say something like, well, I never knew about trans people growing up. This is these kids today. And really, every single continent has examples going back to prehistory of a gender spectrum. So not telling the full history has a very deep impact on how we understand the world that we're in. So we're trying to, one performance and one tour at a time, we're trying to fix that.
And so you talk about these hidden histories, but they're not really hidden. It's kind of hiding in plain sight,
Yeah.
right? So just how do you actually go about finding these stories? Like, what's the sort of process that you go through to find them?
Well, it's really cool to do it here because this is a country that really values its archives. There is a lot of support, although if you ask a Dutch person, they'd say it's less than it was, but there still is, compared to other countries, a lot of support for these specialty archives. So, for example, I know you guys spoke about the anti-gay persecutions in the wake of the shipworm plague. And I went to the city archive and I spent a few days kind of reading through all of the records of those first trials. And I could do that because they were digitized. So there's stuff like that. There's also, I'm really lucky in that there's a lot of people who came before me. So here in the Netherlands, there's a woman named Els Klok who wrote 2 books, 1001 Women in Dutch History and 1001 Women in the Dutch 20th Century. So I have these massive tomes that kind of help me find things. There's a historian who I adore called Mark Ponte who works at the city archive and is really working at getting the city's Black history, which goes back to at least the 16th century, if not before. He works on publicizing that. So, and there's plenty of other examples. Those are just the 2 that jump to mind. There specifically is a Black archives. There's a queer archive. So my queer history tour was, I researched it by going to the queer archives, and this lovely archivist just was confronted by someone being like, I want to learn everything about Dutch queer history. And God bless him, he gave me this pile of books that he held for me day after day after day. And then I'd go back and be like, okay, so I saw this and I want to read more about this. And it was just, he went very far above and beyond to help me get this massive understanding of queer history, which was really lovely.
You've formed a lot of these stories now into tours. You have a company called Badass Tours, giving what some have described as niche tours. Has the reception been for people on the other end of the communication? So how has it actually been received?
It's really beautiful. We just the other day, I gave a career tour to a bunch of university students, and you never know what is going to be the story that hits. For me, a story that we'll talk about later, Michiel van Antwerpen, is like the story that makes me really emotional. But I was telling a different story, and one of the students just burst into tears. And it felt very, like when she came back, she walked away and I gave her space. But when she came back to the group, it felt like she let go of something. Like, I mean, I just met this woman. I don't know anything about her, but the weight seemed to have lifted off of her shoulders. And we get that a lot. We get people reaching out, months, sometimes years later, about a story. That's part of what we do. So in addition to talking about these topics that aren't always talked about, our approach is we tell the stories of people. That's why we're Badass Tours, because we tell the stories of badasses.
And do you think people feel a relatability to the history in that way? You're telling these about these niche topics.
You keep saying niche, and I think you're setting me up. Because I actually don't think it is niche. Women are 51% of the population. Depending on which generation, it's 3 to 25% identify somewhere along the LGBTQIA spectrum. People of color have always been part of European and American society. And we don't have good traveler numbers. But again, I'm covering the vast majority of the population. I'm actually surprised that more that more companies aren't following our lead.
I will not use the word niche again. You focus a lot on LGBTQ plus history in your tours and your talks and the work that you do. Why is it an important topic to bring people's attention to?
That's really interesting. I think we have a lot of misunderstandings. And for me, I'm just going to say, like, I tend to use the word queer instead of LGBTQIA, like in formal communications. I use LGBTQIA or LGBTQIA plus. On our website, we use LGBTQ plus because that's what we found most people were using. But I might just say queer because to me, queer is kind of a rainbow term. Not everyone agrees with that, but I might just say queer and talk about queer history. I think that's especially important because even now, when there's more communication around LGBTQIA issues than there were when I was growing up, it can still be so isolating, especially for young people. It can still feel like no one in the world has ever had my experience. And so I think it is really, really important to say you are part of a long chain of people who've had your experience.
So, talking about a long chain of experience, let's go back into the past, into somewhere at the beginning of that chain. So today, the Netherlands has this reputation for being a progressive, liberal society, rightly or wrongly. But the Dutch Republic of the 17th and 18th centuries also had a reputation for liberalism, and they were permissive to minorities such as Jews and Catholics and Mennonites. Did that also apply to queer people then?
It's really hard to generalize. One of the big challenges in talking about queer history is we sort of have this like progressive idea that like things were, desperately evil and violent in the Middle Ages and we've been on a straight line towards good. And that really isn't the case, especially here in the Netherlands. But it also really differed depending on who you were. So I know this sounds crazy, but in the Middle Ages, what everyone knew, like a basic fact, is that men were these kind of spiritual creatures, these more enlightened creatures, whereas women were more animalistic. It was assumed that women were more sexually driven and men were more enlightened. So you get someone like Erasmus, who's in a priest school writing love letters to one of the other student priests, and everyone just kind of ignores it. Because, of course, it's not good, but you can sort of understand why these enlightened spiritual creatures wouldn't want to, lower themselves to something so bestial. Whereas if women were caught together, it was often punished much more violently. And then for a couple different reasons, as we hit the early modern period, this whole thing flipped. And we started thinking of men as really sexually driven. And we started thinking of women as not sexually driven at all. So we have these women, there's these women in the 17th century who are writing poems to each other and publishing it. And even at the time, people were like, oh, they're such good friends. And now when I tell some of these stories, some historians will be like, oh, these are actually friendship poems. And one of these women wrote a poem about her friend leaving her garter, which is like a piece of underwear, in her room. And the poem references the story of a woman who fell in love with another woman and prayed to be turned into a man so she could marry that woman. Like, this is not a friendship poem, but they kind of, they got away with it.
Framing.
Yeah,
good framing.
It's interesting, right?
Hey, it's fascinating, and I'd love if you could tell us a little bit more about some early known examples of men and women, queer people living in the Netherlands and Amsterdam, and some of these stories you've uncovered. Yeah,
it's fascinating, and it really is. All of it needs to come with, we can't know inside people's experience. I have a friend who's a historian, and she and I have this very healthy debate about what I'm doing, because she argues that queer is a modern understanding and that you have to understand people in their own experience. And I get what she's saying, but I also think I don't totally agree that queer is a modern understanding. I think, attraction and gender is built into us. Like everything that we know about queer and gender identity suggests that this is something internal and that this is something quite old. So, for example, there's this lesbian love triangle out of the 17th century theater. This is one of the stories that I'll be telling this summer on the Daring Women Walk for the Holland Festival, because it's such a perfect fit of like these badass women in theater, where Catharina Questers was a 24-year-old playwright who had this kind of big cultural reputation. Her father was also owned a plumbing company as the canal belt was being built, so she had quite a lot of money as well. She had quite the dowry, and all these men tried to marry her, and she kept saying, no, I value my freedom too highly. And then she's writing poems back and forth with this woman named Cornelia van der Veer, who's a sailmaker's daughter. She's sharing 2 rooms amongst 10 people, whereas Katerina has a room that's just for writing. And Cornelia and Katerina write these poems to each other, including the one I just mentioned, where Katerina writes a poem about Cornelia's garter. And then, just like that, Katerina quits theater, writes a poem describing art and freedom as the enemy of love. She marries a merchant from Leiden. She never writes again. And there are any number of reasons that could have happened. But a little bit later, Cornelia is writing very intense poetry to the daughter of the publisher of the City Theater. A little bit after that, she's writing angry poetry about this daughter, Catherine, ditching her. Meanwhile, Catherine's writing really pretty poems to this woman named Sarah. So you get the sense of like, you could walk into any theater in New York today and hear this exact story. So I love telling this story on my tours because it is a perfect example of like, the world has changed, but some things about us are fundamental.
And so another concrete example which you speak about is the story of a person called Michiel van Antwerpen.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, this is one of my favorite stories. And if you don't mind, I'd like to tell you the fuller version because...
We do not mind.
Excellent. Because one of the things I love about what we do is, in addition to performances, we do all these tours, and I learn from the people on the tours. So... I'm going to say he and Michiel throughout, but I'm talking about someone who is assigned female at birth. So there's different conventions across international borders. So depending on how international your listeners are, I always like to check in and be like, okay, this is even during the time in his life where he was called Maria. I'm just going to be saying Michiel and he throughout. And he was born to a poor brewer's family in Breda. And this is the 17th century where the poor are really getting squeezed. So when he's orphaned at 8, there's nowhere for him to go. So he starts working as a maid at a very young age. And for whatever reason, the daughter of this house really takes against him. So when he's about 16, 17 years old, she thinks to embarrass him by making him serve a public dinner dressed as a man. Now, McKeel has no language for trans. He has no idea that other people have shared his identity. So imagine what it's like being in public in his real gender. It must have been like lightning. But, there's nowhere for a poor person to go. So he keeps working at this household until they fire him because a snowstorm delays him coming back from a family visit. So at this point, he leaps. He goes into a pawn shop, of which, of course, there's many because, poor are getting squeezed. He buys young men's clothes and he goes to a pub where he knows there's a recruiter. I don't know if you guys have gotten here yet, but in the Dutch Republic time, there's a constant need for soldiers because unlike every other country, the Dutch Republic has a standing army. So he gets this big bonus. And so now he's living in the right gender. He's part of the Breda regiment as Jan van Ant. But he's also living with 99 other men. So he has to be really careful to not let them see his body. And he gets through about a year. And then he marries the sergeant's daughter because married couples have their own quarters. And I don't know the answer to your next question, but I have an idea. After about a year and a half, the militia gets restationed in Breda. And that little witch from the house he grew up in recognizes him and turns him in. And he is on trial, not for cross-dressing. He's on trial for lying to the army. And in his trial, he swears that his wife, Joanna, didn't know about marital relations. And he just kept her off by being surly for a year and a half. So Joanna is sent back to her father, ashamed but not disgraced. Now, I would point out this is a woman who grew up in a military camp. I have a lot of trouble believing she doesn't know about marital relations. But you guys can decide what you think happened. And unfortunately, McKeel is punished by having to live as Maria again. So he goes to Gouda, meets a woman named Cornelia, and they elope to Amsterdam. And he tries to not join the militia, because remember, that was the problem the first time around. But again, there's just nothing else for a poor person to do. So he joins the militia as Michiel van Handwerpen. At somewhere in this process, Cornelia gets pregnant. And it's not clear what happened here. It's not clear if she was already pregnant when they met, if she was assaulted, if they had an open relationship. We just don't know. What we do know is that Michiel stood as father to this baby. And from this, we also know that Michiel was Catholic because they went into one of those secret churches, one of those houses that had been turned into Catholic churches that everyone knew was a Catholic church, but we all pretend we don't know it's a Catholic church. And they baptized the child. Now, remember, if you're Catholic in this time period, it's because you care about it. Your life would be way easier if you're a Protestant. And in Catholicism, a godparent is a spiritual commitment. I want you to remember those two things when I tell you that the people who showed up to be godparents were Michiel's brother and Michiel's brother's wife. Unfortunately, the same history played out. Michiel went back to Gouda to check on his old landlady. Someone recognized him. He's put on trial again. And it's from this trial that I know I'm using the right pronouns and the right name. Because he said in the trial, "Ik ben in de natuur mans persoon." I am in my nature a man. And for the longest time, that was how I was telling the story. Isn't this cool? I found a trans guy from the 18th century. Because so often you don't really know what someone's internal experience is. You just kind of know what their actions were. And then my first tour after COVID was a really emotional one. It was a Serbian lesbian couple who really struggled with their families. And we had these really emotional conversations. And then I got to the end of Michiel's story, where the last thing we see of Michiel, he disappears for 2 decades after this trial. And the last thing we see of him was when his family buried him in Breda. And these women and I look at each other, and I suddenly realize this story, it's not really about this trans guy. I mean, it is, but the other important part of this story is that this religious family showed up again and again for their trans family member, even though they didn't even have a language for what he was experiencing. So now I kind of end our tours with a cri de coeur. A lot of the people on our tours are queer. And I end the tours by saying, we have the right to demand more from our families. So I learned from my guests as much as they learned from me. –
unfortunately, though, a lot of history relating to homosexuals comes from a negative standpoint, right? We often have to go to the records of criminal cases, like with Michiel van Antwerpen.
Mm-hmm.
In the Netherlands, so from 1730 till the early 19th century, sodomy was a capital crime here. When, why, how did this change? What did it change? Was the 19th or were the 19th and early 20th centuries different?
Well, one thing to remember that I think often gets left out of that story is that actually the VOC, long before the trials that you talked about in the 1730s, long before that, the VOC had the death penalty. They would tie lovers together and throw them into the ocean. They would stake people at low tide so that they would drown at high tide. There's a guy named Leander Hassenbosch who was left on a deserted island, and we don't know the full story, but he was caught with a man, and they left him on a deserted island. So part of it is the government in some ways following the lead of its most powerful company. Yeah, there's an interesting thing with when Napoleon invaded and they just kind of threw out the Dutch law books because it got rid of, because they threw everything out. So it got rid of the anti-gay law. It also got rid of the precedent that the woman I mentioned earlier, Elizabeth Sampson, had set that interracial marriage is legal. They just threw the whole darn thing out. So legal status was murky in the 19th century. And more than that, it was a really stifling time culturally. There's a story that I find really interesting that's also on the tour of people from the Tachtigers. This was there was rebel movements across the 1880s. This was the Dutch rebel movement, where it was artists who are going to do art that's about real life. And one of the leaders of that movement was Willem Kloos. He was a writer. He was the editor of De Nieuwe Gids, which was their cultural touchstone magazine. And he was drinking himself to death because he couldn't handle his attractions to men in general and to his very straight friend Albert in specific. And as he's spiraling, these two women come in to take care of him. And these two women are in a relationship. And they're just completely cool with it. And so Willem writes these, his poems and his letters are so funny because they go back and forth between being really grateful to Anna and Saar for taking care of him and then furious, how dare these women indulge in what he can't. And then there's a weird thing that happens legally in 1911, where there's this morality law passed. And the morality law, amongst many, many other things, sets the age of consent for gay contact at 21 and the age of consent for straight contact at 16. So this feels like it should be, this is a law acknowledging that gay contact exists, right? It feels like it should be a step forward. And actually, this law is used to frame all gay people as pedophiles. Police harassment really, really steps up. There's surveillance. They have photo books of suspected queers, suspected pedophiles, and they will show them to this is the cops I'm talking about. The cops will show these books to landlords, family members, employers. It wasn't intended to be a queer positive law. It was one of those morality laws, but it had it has an effect that we wouldn't really understand looking at it now.
And we're talking the early 20th century.
1911
on.
So then also in the early 20th century in Amsterdam, it was when the first gay bars opened, as far as I know. One of them is called Café het Mantje, which was started by a person called Bet van Beeren. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I do think it's worth pointing out there have always been queer spaces, as we've been talking about. There was a place that it was on Dam Square in the 1600s, and it looked like it was a place where you could get servants so that men of all classes would have a excuse for going in there. So lower class men are like, oh, I want to be hired out as a servant. Upper class men are like, I'm looking for a servant. Exactly. Actually, it was a queer space. So I would argue that Café het Mantje is the first gay bar in the modern sense of the word, of this is where I can go to sit and be with people like me. And the reason it happened, among other things, is that Bet was this incredibly protective person. So she was 25 years old when she took over her uncle's cafe on the Zeedijk. And she was already out before there was really a word for out. Like, she scooched all over Amsterdam. She probably didn't scooch, but I'm going to say scooch. She buzzed all over Amsterdam in her motorcycle, wearing all leather, with a different cute girl on the back every week, because she was a little bit of a heartbreaker, a little bit of a set him up and knock him down. But despite the heartbreakerness of her, she was incredibly protective. So as soon as she opened Mancha, it became, again, a safe space before that word existed. And it wasn't just for queer people. It was also like there were sex workers in the neighborhood. This is right next to the red light district. And she would, they had a place where they were safe as well. And so she'd sit with them, and she'd stay up drinking with them, and she'd sing with them. But she had to do some things to protect her customers. So this teeny little bar had a pool table to prevent people from dancing. She had to prevent people from touching, so much as touching hands. There was an owl lamp over the bar, and she'd turn it on if she thought that the person who just entered was an undercover cop. And so all of the regulars knew to look for that. So as you guys know, and I hope your listeners know, the Netherlands loses its mind every year on the monarch's birthday. And that goes back. That actually goes back to Emma and Wilhelmina back in 1896. So by the time Bet took over Mancha, the annual craziness on Queen's Day was an established thing. And so Bet would stand in the doorway all day, turning away anyone who she didn't recognize. She'd say, sorry, it's Queen's Day, it's a private party. And under the guise of we're all being crazy for Queen's Day, men would dance with men, women would dance with women. You could come dressed however suited you. So even in this time of police harassment, she was able to create at least one day to just be yourself. So of course, when the Nazis invaded, she turned Mancha into a way station for the resistance. She would hide Jewish people on their way out of the city. She'd hide guns on their way into Amsterdam. And the thing I'm about to tell you, I swear to God, multiple historians have verified it. So I know it's going to sound like a movie, but as far as I can tell, it's historically accurate. So part of why Mancha was so helpful is because, like I said, it's right at the red light district. So ordinary Nazis weren't allowed into the red light district. Only officers were allowed in the red light district. So there was a little bit less surveillance, but the red light district is also right next to the Jewish neighborhood. So this one night, she sees an officer about to come in, and she throws the switch. Because she's got Jewish people in the basement, she's got guns in the attic. And so she starts yelling, oh, I'm sorry, we're having problems with our breaker. And as she does it, she's banging on the floor, stomping around, so that the people in the basement will know to sneak out that little cellar window into the alley. When she thinks they've had enough time, she's like, oh, sorry. She opens the door, turns the light back on, opens the door. The Nazi comes in, he checks the bar, he goes downstairs, there's no one downstairs, and he says, I need to see the rest of the building. And so, of course, she has guns in the attic. These are going to get her in a lot of trouble. So as soon as they go into the stairway, she stops him listen, I couldn't say anything in front of those guys, but I'm on your side. Do you want a drink? I've got some booze in my apartment. She then proceeds to drink this man under the table because, again, she's been drinking with her customers all night for 15 years. She drinks this guy under the table, pours him out into the street, and not only did he not catch the guns in the attic, Mancha doesn't get raided again for the rest of the war because he puts the word out that Bet's on their side.
So life obviously changed drastically for homosexual people, as it did for everyone here during the occupation by Nazi Germany. How did Nazi policy directly affect the lives of queer Netherlanders?
Yeah. So it kind of went across the board. I think there was a sense, it's really hard to tell with that generation, right? So there are two queer resistance heroes, and I have to point out, there are a lot of queer resistance heroes, not just in the Netherlands, but Josephine Baker was in France, Toto Koopman was in Italy, throughout a lot of the people who really risked their lives to fight the Nazis were, somewhere on the sexual orientation spectrum outside of straight. So there was these two, Villemar Ondeus was an openly gay painter, and Frida Belinfante was the first woman in Europe to run an orchestra. She ran a chamber orchestra out of the Concertgebouw. And she dated very dramatic women, in my personal opinion. And she said in an interview later that as she and Willem got involved in the resistance, they never actually talked about what they had in common. Like, I had been describing both of them as openly gay for years. And then I kind of rewatched, because, it's a long interview, and I had just missed that particular comment when I was doing all my research into her initially, or I missed the weight of it, I guess. And then I was looking through it again to prepare for a performance at the Jewish Museum about Pride. And I was just so struck by that like, even though they knew what they had in common, like Bet van Buren, there are pictures at the city archive of Bet and Willem on a double date with Willem's boyfriend and Bet's flavor of the week. So they would have, it wasn't that big of a scene. They would have known each other, but they never talked about it. What they did talk about is Frida said they knew they were going to die, but they knew their deaths were going to matter in the resistance. And they did a lot of important things. The group that they were part of, Group 2000, also plays into women's history because it was run by a woman named Jacoba van Tongeren. And Jacoba was she ran that thing with military precision, but she's sometimes kind of dismissively referred to as the ration card queen because Jacoba didn't believe in violence. She thought the Germans have made it clear that any violence will be returned tenfold, so we are not going to do anything violent. We are just going to get people hidden and fed. And honestly, the ration cards are the most valuable thing you can do as a resistance fighter because the Nazis put the entire country on rations because they made the entire country part of their war machine. So even if you were like a Protestant, white Protestant Dutch person, you didn't have quite enough food for yourself, much less feeding someone in hiding. So these ration cards that Willem and Frida and Group 2000 run by Jacoba, these ration cards they were creating were really important, as were their identity cards, because you needed to the Nazis were trying to push all the Jewish people into Amsterdam, so you needed to get out of Amsterdam. It was much safer as a Jewish person, but you needed one of those identity cards that said you weren't Jewish. So they're doing all of these forgeries. And as the persecution ramps up, so do the forgeries, and they realize they have a problem because if the Nazis compare it to the city registry, they'll see that they're forgeries. Part of the reason, just because this is a part of the story that isn't told, part of the reason is that there's still religion on identity papers. There was a woman named Lau Mazerl, who was a lawyer, who spent the 1930s begging the Dutch government to take religion off identity cards. So sometimes people are like, oh, we couldn't have known. And there was literally someone banging on the door saying, look what's happening in Germany. Take this off identity cards. Anyway, so Group 2000 has this problem. So they decide to solve it by blowing up the city registry. And they dress up as policemen. Willem is one of the policemen. They go in, they sedate the guards, they drag the guards out, they blow up 800,000 records, they steal 600 passbooks, which were really hard to forge, and 50,000 guilders. Sometimes people point out that there were other registries, and I think certainly, yes, that's true, but also this is 1943. This is March of 1943. The Netherlands has been occupied for 3 years. All you know under occupation is what you can get from a resistance paper or what the Nazis tell you. On top of whoever they saved by destroying these records, just the very fact of this attack inspired Amsterdammers. So of course, the Nazis put a lot of energy into finding out who did it. The group couldn't meet together. They didn't want to risk it. So they had these pass-bys scheduled. Like at 2:00, we're going to walk down the street in opposite directions. And if there's any information we need, we'll say it as we pass by. Frida had one scheduled with a guy named Rudy. And when Rudy didn't show, she immediately went into hiding. I'll tell you about how she escaped, but that ended up being the right choice because when she finally got back, there was a Gestapo seal on her apartment from that day. So if she'd gone home, she probably would have been captured. Willem was captured. And so Lau, that same lawyer, was allowed in to see him the night before he died. I don't quite know how this happened, but they bribed the guards to bring in this kind of cake he loved And they actually had kind of like, I guess like a goodbye party. And Laos said that Willem was content, at peace, and that he said his last words would be, "Let this show that gay men are not cowards." Frida tried to stay in hiding. She was dressing as a man. She has the story of passing her own mother on the street and her mother didn't recognize her, which, I also wonder if mom recognized her and didn't want to say anything. But she realized the Nazis were looking so hard for her, she was worried she'd endanger her friends. So she had this wild story of escaping through Belgium. She got through Belgium. She got to the French border with this guy, Tony, who she was escaping with. And the resistance couple that ran this farmhouse at the French border said, "It's a blizzard. Are you crazy? You have to go back." And Frida was like, "Yeah, we don't have anywhere to go back to." So they cross this freezing river. They strip down. Tony's taller than her. Frida's much shorter than I am. So Tony's carrying their clothes above his head. They walk naked through this river. They get to the other side, try to pat down as best they can, and walk into Switzerland. What they didn't know is that Switzerland had stopped accepting single men. So when they went to try and register as refugees, they turned Tony away. So Frida stayed and Tony didn't. And Frida had a difficult time in Switzerland. She, was kind of outcast. And when she got back, it wasn't just that, so obviously a lot of her friends were dead, but I think one of the things that's so striking about the way the Netherlands responded to the Nazi invasion was this veil of silence dropped quite quickly after the invasion was over. Jacoba was broken by what she saw. One of her lieutenants went against her orders about violence, and in response, the Germans dragged 30 prisoners out of the prison and left the bodies in the middle of a public street. And that was something that Jacoba really, she only saw the people she lost. She never let herself see the people she saved. So Frida left, and she went to the U.S. and she kind of never looked back until she was 91 and the U.S. Holocaust Museum interviewed her, which is where a lot of the color of this story comes from.
The gay and lesbian community in the Netherlands lost a lot of members, as you said, to not only Nazi violence, but in concentration camps, famine, starvation, brutal execution as well. In the aftermath, so you said a veil of silence descended. Were there any forms of recognition of their sacrifices, contributions, or is that also, again, just looking at it through a modern lens?
I think not until much later. It's really striking. So much of the Dutch 20th century, looks like a person who's repressing difficult memories. So many things that happened in the 50s and 60s are a response to the fact that there was just no one ever talked about it. And it comes out in weird ways, like high-level Nazis. There were high-level Nazi trials. But one of the things Frida pointed out is a lot of the rank and file collaborators just got to go on with their lives. There was never any reckoning for who was in the resistance versus who collaborated. And there was a council that kind of organized the resistance, and not all of them survived. But one of the guys who did said there was never more than 4 figures in the resistance. So that's fewer than 10,000 in a country of 11 million. It's pretty clear he wasn't talking about the women, because women often played the role of courier because Nazis were less likely to search them. But even so, double it to 20,000. A vanishingly small part of the population was part of the resistance. And yet, because there was never a reckoning after World War II, so many Dutch people are convinced that their grandfather was in the resistance.
Every single Dutch person, their grandparent was in the resistance.
Grandfather.
Yeah.
I've yet to hear someone say my grandmother was in the resistance, and there are a lot of examples, not just Jacoba. There's Hannie Schaft, there's Annick van Hardeveld, there's so many women in the resistance, and yet you never hear someone say that their grandmother was in the resistance. And it's also weird, people of color were disproportionately represented. There was a much higher percentage of Black and Indonesian resistance fighters than in the general population. And I also never hear that from Black and Indonesian Dutch people. I just hear it from white Dutch people. But that's partly because there was never a reckoning. There's never there was no structure in place for Jewish survivors. Otto Frank's house was stolen. A lot of people's property was stolen, and there was no way around it.
People were told to pay their taxes that they'd missed in their time in concentration camps.
Yeah. And just on a larger level. So like, it wasn't just Jewish people and resistance fighters and queer people and people of color who suffered during the war. The last winter of the war was called the Hunger Winter because people starved and froze to death en masse. And there was no support, no coming together. So it's not just that people were closing the door out of shame. Like, people across the country had truly suffered. And we're just not going to talk about it. We're going to pretend it didn't happen. So it kind of comes out in odd ways.
We do now have a monument for victims of gay persecution. And we'll get to that, but a lot of it is thanks to the work of something called the Shakespeare Club, which was developed in 1946 or came out in 1946. Can you tell us about the Shakespeare Club?
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? So it started as the Shakespeare Club, and then it became the Culture and Relaxation Center. And it's so interesting to me. So the whole thing was pseudonyms. Everyone joined in a pseudonym. But there are two turning points in Dutch queer history that are connected to there. I guess three, if you include the building of the Homo Monument, which was the first monument in the world to victims of anti-gay violence. One was in 1968, Europe's first gay rights protests happened because of the COC, because that law, the 21 plus law, was still on the books. So the COC did not allow anyone to join who was under 21. They were afraid that the COC would get disbanded. And COC is the successor of the Shakespeare Club. They were afraid it would get disbanded. And yet, you have all these 18-year-olds showing up in Amsterdam who have heard about queer life, and they want to go to the COC's dances. The COC would hold these parties, these dances that were just for queer people. And so this woman named Joka Swiebel, among others, applies to the COC. The COC turns her down. You have to wait till you're 21. So Joka is one of the people who organizes a protest in front of the Binnenhof, our House of Parliament, in 1968, protesting for an end to this law. And they get it. The law is eventually overturned. They're allowed to join the COC. But there's a bit of a schism, because in order to overturn these laws, all of these student groups got together. And these student groups are really confrontational. That's how they got the law overturned. But the generation ahead of them wants to integrate by showing we're just like you. So Joka and her generation they're going to straight parties and making out, like they're in your face. And the community is brought together by a man named Benno Premsela, which is funny because he actually kind of initiated this strategy. So Benno took over the COC in 1962 using his own name, which again, no one used their own name. And a couple of years later, he went on TV. Now, he was kind of already a nationally known figure. He'd saved the Bijenkorf through his window designs. Like, there wasn't a lot to do in the 1950s, so people would come to Amsterdam to see these new window displays. He had a design firm that designed this lamp and rug that a lot of people had. And then in 1964, he went on TV with a popular reporter and just talked really simply and openly about his life as a gay man. And no one had ever done that before. And by showing people, I'm just like you. I want to live with the person I love. I want to take care of him as we get older. It really started to push the needle. And then just a couple years later, these student groups get integrated, and it looks like there's going to be a schism between Benno's generation, because Benno was born in 1920, and these student groups. And Benno serves as kind of this unifying figure. And I have to say about Benno, so when you research people, you find their flaws. Like, I had been idolizing Bet van Beura, and then I found this interview with her youngest sister that talked about her drinking problem and that she was lonely because she could never hold a relationship. And at first I was really sad, and then I was like, no, it's actually really inspiring that Bet didn't have to be superhuman to make such a huge difference. Because I think Bet and Benno, I think the community Bet created and the leadership that Benno offered are the two reasons why gay marriage happened here first, or two of the reasons. So the Holocaust Museum hired me to develop a show about Benno and some of his family members. And so I kind of went in expecting to find flaws because he's human, right? Did not find a one. One of his friends actually described him as a moral hero. And when we went to do this show, it was a small audience and they were listening intently, but it felt weird. Like they were really listening, but they also weren't reacting to the like the twists and the turns in the story. And when I started talking to people afterwards, I realized it was because everyone, or the majority of the audience, were his friends and family. So they already knew the twists and turns. And every single one of them had a story about Benno helping them, or Benno inspiring them, or Benno supporting them in some way. And I try to work his story into all of my tours because I just find it so inspiring that just kindness can have such a lasting influence.
And can you talk a little bit about that lasting influence? So how did Benno shape the latter half of the 20th century for sort of gay rights and freedoms in Amsterdam and the Netherlands?
Well, he passed away before gay marriage happened, but I do think keeping the community together in the 70s was a really important thing. I think, so Benno had survived the war in hiding, and he and his brother were his family's sole survivors. They lost their mother, father, sister, cousins, aunts, uncles. And he, on the back of that, decided to never hide again, which is how he ended up coming out so publicly. But he also believed deeply that any form of discrimination can lead to the gas chamber. So in addition to being pro-gay rights, he was anti-racist, he was feminist. So I think having such a kind person really bringing all these different constituencies together, I think that was really important. I think another really important thing, Benno was one of the people who was kind of leading the committee on the Homo Monument. And the Homo Monument opened in 1987 during the AIDS crisis. So it has always been a place of both celebration and mourning. Like, it's the first canal parade, the first gay pride canal parade was in preparation for the Gay Games, which would be in Amsterdam a couple years later. And it goes, it was 1996, and it goes right by where the Homo Monument is. So there's a long history of the Homo Monument being part of pride and part of celebrations. But it's also, most days that you go there are flowers and a picture. And sometimes you know what it is. Sometimes it's in response to an atrocity, but a lot of times it's just someone from the community who's passed away, and it's a place where we all go together. So there's just a real beauty to that place. And I think Benno and Bet show the power of simple community, that just by creating this community, they were able to really change how people in the Netherlands felt. And like you said earlier, it also really helps that there is a long history here of you do your thing, I'm going to do my thing. As long as your thing doesn't affect me, go your own way, I'm going to go mine. And that's, tolerance was groundbreaking in the 17th century. England, France, Germany, they're all murdering each other over Catholic versus Protestant. And here it was like, we symbolically push them out on a boat, and just the leaders. We know where the boat's going to land. We know that they're fine. And like, listen, just put your church in a house, and I'm going to pretend I don't know it's there. So that kind of tolerance, and, having Jewish people practice openly, it was Jerusalem of the West. That kind of tolerance, while it's not enough in a modern society, we want integration, not just tolerance. It was a really good foundation for, people being like, okay, well, I'm not gay, but, they're doing their thing. It doesn't affect me. Sure, let them get married.
So in 2001, the first gay marriages happened in Amsterdam. Is the Netherlands now today a gay and lesbian utopia? Or what kind of challenges do queer people face in the Netherlands today?
Well, I think it's compared to what? And I think it's the different members of the community have really different experiences. I think middle class, especially cis men, but middle class cis people, it's really safe here. Like so safe that there was recently a community effort to save one of the gay bars because unlike when Bet started Mancha, you just go with your girlfriend or boyfriend to a bar. Like it doesn't need to be a gay bar. There's a lot of safety, especially if you're white, especially if you're cis. I don't think that always translates to people who are on the gender spectrum. I don't think that always translates to people who are Black, people who are Indonesian. So it's hard to, like, it's a lot better than so many other places. And, I think we were talking about earlier about knowing that we need to keep moving forward, but also being grateful for what we have. This place is amazing. This city is amazing. It can get better and it should get better and we should all work to make it better, but also it's amazing.
So what do you think the main lessons that other countries should take from the Netherlands are?
I just said something about toleration and now you're making me support it. Yeah, like I said, I think full integration is our goal, right? Like I think tolerance is only the beginning. Like I think we want to accept people of all races, of all gender expressions, of all sexual orientations. Like we want a fully functioning society that accepts people just as people. But I do think we're a tiny country that has punched way above our weight for centuries, in part because of that tolerance, because there is room. You can find a space that is yours. And in so many other countries, God, so many of the people I talk to, it's really violent. So it's much safer here, and I'm really grateful for that. Yeah, it's hard to know, right? Because I want there to be more space across the board for trans and non-binary people. Like the Dutch language makes it really, really challenging. Non-binary is so hard. Like the Dutch language still has gendered words for professions. Like I say, ik ben schrijver, I'm a writer, but that's the male word. And possibly because of my accent, Dutch people correct me constantly. And they say, no, je bent schrijfster, female writer. And I'm like, no. People who write are people who write. I'm not going to use a gendered word, but you can imagine, like, that's just me as a cis woman. You can imagine what it's like for a non-binary person being told, like, je bent schrijfster. Like, that must be really, really uncomfortable. So there's places to go, but I'm biased. I feel like this is so much better than so many of the experiences of people around me, both in the storytelling community and the people on the tours, that, yeah, I know where we need to be to improve. And also I see things being so much better than the experiences of so many people I care about.
Thank you so much, Elyzabeth, for giving so much to us today. If people want to find you and find your tours, how can they do that?
Well, we do both tours and storytelling performances. We're really fortunate in that we've got these great storytellers, and we're starting to do more and more stories for museums. So right now we're doing a storytelling tour of the exhibit at the Stadsarchief, the City Archive. Holland Festival has asked us in June to do a tour called the Daring Women Walk. It's a response to one of the pieces in the Holland Festival. So we're doing a tour of badass women from the 17th century. And then, for our tours, we have Women's History Tour, Queer History Tour, Jewish History Tour, and our Hidden Gems, which covers, all of our tours are intersectional, but Hidden Gems specifically goes into more Black and Indonesian history, as well as women and queer people and Jewish people. And then we also do our customized private tours, which are my favorite, when someone just reaches out and says, I like architecture and my husband likes Black history and we're both Jewish. Go. So we have a variety, and you can find them all at badasstours.nl.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming in and sharing your time and expertise and stories with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Do you want to know more about Flemish and Dutch history and culture? Visit www.the-low-countries.com. This podcast is made by Republic of Amsterdam Radio.